So this session is about slavery as it's seen in the New Testament, and it's quite different from the scene in the Old Testament. And of course, there'll be a different video on that. You don't want to confuse the two with one another. And the point, of course, is that the context is quite different. In the Old Testament, Israel, for most of the time anyway, ruled itself as a nation. But in the New Testament, we're in the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire makes the rules, and the Christians can't change the system. So it's no good saying slavery should work like this. You're stuck with what the Romans say slavery is going to be, and there's nothing that you can do about it. And this time, slaves are real slaves. There's no limit to what the master can do to the slave. You can have him crucified if he feels like it. It's just part of what goes on in the Roman Empire. So there are rules, though, for the way that a Christian is going to treat a slave. First of all, there's an equality of status inside the congregation. So you mustn't treat a slave, if you're a freeman, you mustn't treat a slave as a slave. There's no difference. And there are three different verses that say that. Galatians 3:28, there's neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, no male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So there are three passages which tell you that there's no difference in status in the New Testament between a slave and a free person within the congregation. Now, the one that comes up, the one that everyone talks about as being the dreadful thing in the New Testament is this verse: bondservants, obey in everything those who are earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of their heart, fearing the Lord. Now, I'm not quite sure why people say that's a dreadful thing to do. For a Roman slave, that is a good survival strategy. If you start rebelling against your master, then he's going to do something really nasty to you. So that is jolly good advice for a Roman slave. And it's something that repeats, it comes up in a couple of other passages as well. But the New Testament recognizes you're better off if you're not a slave. So if you start off as a slave and you get a chance to get your freedom, then take the opportunity. But it says, don't worry in the meantime. Keep your head down. Keep going. So it seems a good thing for a slave to be free, but you can carry on inside the Christian community even if you are a slave. Now, some people would own slaves. There wouldn't be that many in the congregation to start off with, but there will be perhaps a few. And he says, right, if you're a master, then you treat your bondservants, your slaves, justly and fairly, knowing that you're a slave to God, you're a fellow slave with them, so treat them well. And there's another one, don't threaten them. And the emphasis there, again, it's on well-being of slaves, it's not on freedom. And I have to ask why that is, because being a slave wasn't that good in the Roman Empire, but neither was being a freeman. If you were a slave who was freed, then you're selling your labor in an economy which has slaves in it who are selling their labor for nothing at all. So you've got to have a very special skill before you're going to make a living. And so what happens with the freedman is the freedman then goes back to the man who freed him, typically picks up a patron. He might go and do a service for somebody else. He says, what can I do for you? And the patron says, do this. And then the patron will give him food, maybe give him lodging or whatever. The difference between a freedman and a slave was not very great in the Roman Empire, unless you had a very special skill as a freedman. You know, the freedman who became the sort of top of the civil service under Claudius had very special skills in leadership and administration. But in general, that wasn't the case. If you were a laborer, you were in trouble because a slave would do the labor. So that's why it doesn't say release them, send them out there. They might as well just treat them well, because the only best you can happen to your freemen is you treat them well. And again, we've got an example. We've got Philemon, the book. Philemon's the owner of the slave. The slave's called Onesimus, and he's run away. Apparently he's stolen something from Philemon, and then he's got to Rome, and there he's found Paul, or maybe been found by Paul, and Paul is returning him to Philemon, and he writes a letter which goes with it and says what's going to happen. And you can see the kind of thing that's in there. He's saying, Onesimus is very dear to me. Be careful for him. He's saying he'd like to have kept Onesimus with him, then he would have looked after Onesimus. Of course, Onesimus would have needed Paul to look after him, need someone to look after him. But he's sending him back. And he's saying, look, I want you to be good with this chap, but you've got to choose what to do. You've got to decide what you're going to do. That's up to you. And he's giving a sort of moral choice to Philemon. And the interesting thing is that in the meantime, Onesimus has been baptized, become a Christian. And so he's not just a bondservant, he's a brother as well. And he's going to be a friend of Philemon, whether he's released or not. But the way that Onesimus is being treated is actually remarkably lenient. For a runaway slave, you'd expect something rather worse than that in the Roman Empire. So, much less of it. Summary you've got, it's part of society. The church could not change society. There's nothing the ecclesia could do to make society run on different rules. Slavery is there and you can't do anything about it. So what they have to do is work within the system which is going to allow slavery. And well, there's a requirement for the slave to obey their masters, but that's good for their well-being. If they obey their masters, they're less liable to get beaten or killed, which could happen to a Roman slave. And if you're a master, then you treat your slaves as fairly as you can, and that way you look after them, and they are not as badly off as other slaves in the system. Remembering a freeman might simply starve. So what happens is that you're making, well, they stay dependent on you, but you're going to be a good master rather than leaving them free to become dependent on someone who may be a lot worse than you are. So the New Testament gives the best solution for the circumstances. You could wish that the circumstances were different, that they didn't have Roman slavery, but the New Testament provides the best solution you can get for those circumstances. Okay, there's a bonus point here. That's something that's cropped up. There are 3 copies of this still in existence, and it's a thing called the Slave Bible. It was a Bible which was released for slaves. It was produced originally for slaves in the West Indies, but it was also used in the United States. That's the frontispiece of it. And it's a Bible, but it's a Bible where they've cut out all the bits which might encourage a slave to demand more from the masters or disobey them or to escape to freedom. Now, that interesting thing is just how much they had to remove. It's possibly a little unfair to say that they were removed just for that purpose. The person who published this was, in fact, an anti-slaver. He was someone who was against slavery. But the book is really, it's cut down to the point where the slave master would allow it through. It's got as much of the Bible as you could get in that the slave owners would allow to go to their slaves. And you can see the side. We've got the King James version. It's based on the King James version, which is why I've put that for the comparison. There are 1189 chapters in the King James Bible, the authorized version. The Slave Bible has 232 chapters. It's had to cut out an awful lot in order to make it acceptable to the masters of slaves. So you can see that how much of the Bible is really, when it comes down to it, inimical to modern slavery. And that's an interesting point to make. And it's a very worthwhile one. So there we go.